Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome everyone to this new episode of All Things Policy, our daily podcast. And today we have with us Mike Nelson, who is a senior fellow in the Carnegie Asia Program. He helps decision makers understand and address the impacts of emerging technologies, such as digital technologies, biotechnology, and machine learning. He has worked with Cloudflare, Microsoft, IBM, and the White House previously. And I am Lokendra, and with me is Rijesh and Bharath. We are researchers at Takshashila. So, Mike, why don't you tell us what all interesting work you have done in digital policy since the 1980s?
Well, let me try to summarize 35 years of work in 2 minutes. I have had 8 of the most exciting jobs in digital policy, starting with working in the U.S. Congress. I worked with Senator Al Gore when he was one of the few people who would ever use the internet or had any clue what it was. He was also very interested in high performance computing. And over time, we convinced people that without the high performance computing, the internet won't be that useful. And without the internet, all these supercomputer centers would not be that useful. And we explained to a lot of senators, a lot of journalists, what this opportunity was. And that's been my career. I've had 8 dream jobs, but the consistent mission has been to explain what the future could be and then stop stupid stuff. Stop policymakers from doing things that would get in the way of the digital future. The most exciting work was probably in the Senate and at the White House. At the White House, I was one of 2 people who were doing internet policy because the internet was only about 100,000 people. It wasn't even commercial. And we had an open field. We created the whitehouse.gov website. We were the most popular website in the world because there were only 9,000 websites. We built it for $330,000. It took about 10 MIT fellows who came to Washington for the summer. And that's what it took. Back then, we didn't have a lot of problems with cybersecurity. We weren't doing streaming audio and video. So it was relatively easy. And we had a huge impact because once the president had a website, every cabinet secretary had to have a website. Every CEO was yelling at the IT team, says, Bill Clinton's got a website. Where's my website? Every governor. I mean, it really helped spur interest. So that was maybe the most exciting time. But back then, we were making billion-dollar decisions. Now we're making trillion-dollar decisions. And at Carnegie, my mission is to go around the world helping share success stories, helping show where countries like India, like Korea, like the US, have made difficult choices and pushed through policies that encourage investment, encourage innovation, encourage transparency. These are all the key ingredients to good digital policy and to having a thriving digital economy. And that's why I'm really excited about talking about this new report. It's called Korea's Path to Digital Leadership. It focuses on Korea, but we look at the United States, Malaysia, and Japan.
So why don't you tell us the key insights you have from this report? And I think you have developed a grading mechanism, a subjective grading mechanism. So why don't you tell us something about it?
Yeah. Well, I learned on Capitol Hill that if you want to motivate politicians to do something, particularly something that requires either money or effort and political capital, there are a few things that are as effective as a report card. A report card that says, you're doing a good job. That's helpful because, they want to take credit for good stuff. So they'll hold the report card up and say, hey, I'm going to do more of this because we want to be the top. We want to be number one. But even better is when you say, you're getting a C and almost a D, don't get an F. That motivates people even more. And so in this report, for the 4 countries I mentioned, Korea, Malaysia, the US, and Japan, we identified 11 thorniest digital policy issues. These are issues where In some cases, countries have been struggling for 10 or 20 years to figure out what a good policy is. Sometimes they have 3 policies. Other times the policy changes every 9 months. And this is chaos. And it really holds back investment, and it doesn't serve internet users well. And so the issues include broadband competition. Do you have policies that drive down the price of getting connected? Encryption is an obvious one. That was the first issue I worked on in the Clinton White House 31 years ago, and we still haven't got a good solution. Cybersecurity, digital identity, which is a key part of cybersecurity. Content moderation, getting rid of offensive material. This is, again, very emotional. Data architecture, data protection, and that's the list of classes that or topics that we graded different countries on. And Korea does some things really well. They've done quite well on digital identity, not as well as India. India has had digital leadership. You've had Modi pushing the idea that everyone should be able to identify themselves online. And Korea has had some of that for the last 5 years. And so after 20 years of trying, they finally have a good solution. The thing they're doing worst is probably cybersecurity of their government systems. They've had some incredible breaches. They also have a very, very sophisticated cyber adversary. The North Koreans, of course, have hacked into sites all around the world. They fund their entire nuclear program by stealing cryptocurrency. It's at least, it's billions of dollars. So the other thing they're doing very, very poorly is after 30 years of having really good policies for broadband and developing their systems better than almost anybody else in Asia, they decided that they wanted to subsidize the 3 large politically powerful phone companies. And so those phone companies convinced the parliament to get subsidies from the streaming companies and from the social media companies. This has been proposed in other places, particularly in the European Union, and rejected. In Korea, they actually did it. And the result has been higher prices. A number of companies that were providing service to Koreans for free have now said, well, we're not going to give you a free service if we have to pay the phone companies. So they've pulled out. And in the end, there'll be fewer new companies trying to provide ISP service. So in the long run, this is going to be a disaster. It's already a disaster for the users who don't get all the services they want. But it's sad because the Koreans are very smart. But this is raw political power. This is the phone companies wanting more money.
So what are the lessons you think India can learn from the Korean experience?
Well, I think the main lesson is to ask what's good for the user. So having a user-centric approach. What will this policy do for the average person who wants new services, faster bandwidth? I think the hardest problem is that everybody can buy the economic analysis that they want, particularly phone companies with lots of money. And so if you simply go on the analysis of the different economists, they all will have different assessments and different projections. If instead you go and look at actually what's happened in the experiments, like the Korean experiment, I think you'll get to the right place.
So based on the Korean experience, we shouldn't be listening to the telecom players in India and, making OTT players pay certain fees for using the telecom infrastructure.
If I were advising the members of parliament
Yes.
and the regulatory agencies, I would definitely say, don't follow the Korean model.
It doesn't work.
In Europe, they did the analysis. They took a user-centric approach, and they rejected what was called the fair share initiative. That's the other thing to learn, is that if you don't have a good buzzword and the other side does, you almost always lose. And in the case of Europe, we didn't have a counter buzzword because we just wanted to preserve the model that has worked so well. But we did have a good slogan. And the slogan was, if it ain't broke, Why fix it? And again, nothing has grown. No infrastructure has grown as fast as the internet globally. And that's because we had this wonderful system where everybody paid to get on the internet and you could discover all the great riches, all the wonderful applications. And that's the way it worked. The phone companies, they looked at the cable television network and said, we want to be like the cable television network. We want to be the monopoly or the duopoly in the middle. We want to charge the users to connect to us, and we want to charge all the content providers. But that's limited the amount of content, that's raised the prices. Look at all the different models before you choose one.
So thanks, Mike, for setting up a good background. For our listeners, this podcast is a freewheeling conversation with Mike on all digital policy issues. And we'll be also discussing AI, we'll be discussing supply chain security. So Rijesh, we'll jump on to AI now. And you had some really fascinating question on AI. So
I had a pre-question before the AI question.
Okay, please go ahead.
So, you've spoken about thinking about cybersecurity for government systems as separate from for consumer systems, right? So how do you think about them differently?
Well, you use different approaches. Obviously, with the government, often the problem is lack of resources.
Right.
If you're a big bank like Morgan Stanley and the companies in New York, they have billions of dollars. Some of them spend $500 million a year on cybersecurity because they know if they have a massive failure or a colossal hack, they're going to lose billions of dollars, and the competition will take a lot of their customers. So the motivation is very different, and the policy initiatives needed are very different. With the governments, often it's not that you need to adopt best practices. You just have to get to average practices. And often that requires replacing 15-year-old systems.
Right.
We were blessed because we had Y2K 25 years ago. And so all these companies doubled.
Kind of forced an upgrade.
And the governments in particular, because they had some of the most obsolete systems. I was at IBM at the time. It was the largest IT company in the world. And it was doing a lot of the retrofitting and replacement. And the result, in the 2 years after I joined IBM, I joined in 1998, the stock price doubled because they did two things. They got all this new revenue from all these companies who had doubled or tripled their IT investment. And my team helped convince the world that IBM was an internet company. When we told people that in 1998, they would scratch their head and go, no. IBM makes laptops and IBM makes big pieces of hardware. But we showed them that, we had a vision for the internet, and we rode the bubble. Right. Now Cisco, it was in the internet business and nothing else. So its stock price went up by a factor of 40 in 2 years. Ours went up a good amount and made us all very happy.
But just following up on that, Mike, I kind of find that governments in particular, when they think about cybersecurity or encryption, right? Like we've had this entire spate of the NIST has come out with post-quantum cryptography, 4 or 5 algorithms that's been released. But you find in government a strong tendency to not just adopt, say that. Like I would imagine that if a Morgan Stanley wanted to do post-quantum cryptography, they'd just say, "Oh, the NIST has done the competition. These are the 5 that we've selected.
Yeah.
It's a very robust thing. They've done it for over 3 years." Morgan Stanley might say, let's just pick the best one, implement it. But governments seem to have this belief that we don't want to trust somebody else's encryption.
It depends on which government. I mean, some governments, particularly smaller countries, they have a well-coordinated, somewhat centralized approach to IT procurement. And they can look at what other countries are doing and kind of adopt best practices. Some of them just, hire the right consultants. Unfortunately, too often governments hire the least competent and lowest price consultants.
Right.
And they end up with special bespoke solutions that maybe work for a year or two, and then something better is out there, but the consultant or the systems integrator doesn't have the resources, or it's gone out of business. I mean, there's a lot of reasons that government procurement of IT has been so abysmal. I taught a class when I was at Georgetown on e-government 2.0, and this was back more than 12 years ago. And one of the books was a wonderful book in New Zealand on e-government failures. And unfortunately, it was about the only book I could find. Nobody wants to boast about their failures. But time and again, it was people weren't rewarded for looking 10 years into the future. They weren't rewarded for taking risks. A lot of the people who were running the IT systems were 58 years old, and they were 5 years away from retirement, and taking on some major new initiative just was too hard. So it hasn't changed that much, except we have the cloud. And in a way, cloud is like Y2K was. Y2K forced a lot of companies to rethink how they did IT. The cloud has given people an opportunity to go into the next generation of applications. And it's much more efficient, and you're relying on the cybersecurity solutions of the biggest, most successful companies in the world.
So in some sense, everything converges to a broad set of global practices.
Oh, yeah, exactly. Luckily, we still have several different hyperscalers that you can choose from. And so there's competition that forces them to all be as good as they can possibly be.
Correct. So now to the AI question. You were telling us about how you had worked on the original National Internet Infrastructure Plan. And my question to you then, I repeat that, is if you had to build a national AI plan for any government, what would you suggest? What would be your recommendation?
Well, what we did is right after President Clinton and Vice President Gore got into office, and literally 4 weeks after they were there, they went to Silicon Valley and they released a 16-page vision statement. Mm-hmm. And so we started with the future. We said, this is where we want to be in 10 or 12 years. And we talked about digital libraries. We talked about e-commerce, e-business, and particularly education. That was a really big thing. And we talked about which agencies were going to do what. And we developed reports that went from the vision. Second report was the strategy, and the third report was the tactics. And that's where you get to deadlines and hold people responsible for delivering on these problems. Half of what we did wasn't brand new investment or some new bill. Half of what we did was getting rid of old stuff. If you want e-commerce, you can't require every signature to be ink on paper. So we got rid of those requirements. And there were lots of good reasons for that in 1970, but we developed digital signatures and did it very quickly, because it's often easier to get rid of something old than it is to create something new. So that's the first thing I would do, is lay out the vision of what AI could be for us. Maybe not 10 years, but certainly 6 or 7 years. Then sit down and go, okay, what gets in the way? What are the barriers? I spend most of my time on data policy. We have about 12 people at Carnegie who are working on different aspects of AI. One guy is just focused on AI policy in China, mm-hmm. which is a fascinating case study. But if we don't get the data right, it doesn't matter what we tell Google and Amazon and Facebook to do with their algorithms. So that's one place I would push people to work very hard. Another one is the question of security, because I do think the need for these AI systems to be reliable is going to give us even one more reason to invest in cybersecurity. And I think the other thing that we don't pay enough attention to is the need for more transparency. Somehow there's this idea that governments around the world are all going to tell these companies that are making these AI systems, you have to build your algorithm to work this way, and that's going to solve all our problems. That sounds so easy, and that's why they're proposing this, right? We're just going to regulate 6 or 7 big companies that have all sorts of resources, and they'll magically make all the problems go away. Well, they got to focus on 100,000 companies and government organizations who are going to be using AI for critical functions. They have to do the hard work of actually looking at how these tools will be applied. There's no way that Amazon can fix every possible misuse. Yeah. So that's I think, again, let's have a user focus rather than a developer focus. And the developers, they have limited powers.
So,
But the politicians think that technology is magic, and particularly AI. It's totally magic, because they keep telling them to do all these things and do it tomorrow, do it for free, make sure it always works. You don't get that.
So on AI governance, when we look at it globally, the US is pushing soft touch regulation. Europe is pushing for a risk-based regulation, which is more hard. And then we have India, right? How do you discern the Indian approach to AI regulation right now, AI governance right now?
India is much more like the United States.
Okay.
I mean, you first of all, you have an aversion to centralization. First, you have all the different layers of government. You also have agencies that are fighting with each other about who gets to control what, and that's very healthy. You are looking at what other countries are doing, but I think it's beneficial to have the India attitude. We don't want to do what everybody else is doing. We're going to find a better way. That's the message I've heard for 30 years when I've been talking to my Indian counterparts. So I also think, and you might disagree with me, but the decentralized nature of the discussion means that things don't happen tomorrow. The data protection law should have been implemented a little faster, but it kept getting better and better along the way. And I think you did learn from some of the mistakes in other countries. The European system is the worst because, and correction, the proposed bill that just got vetoed by the governor of California was the worst.
Yeah.
Because they took the European law and made it worse.
Yep.
I mean, what the Europeans did is they drafted a pretty good bill inside the commission. All the people who had really studied the issue and really understood how software works, they had done a limited bill, but it was a good approach, and it was risk-based, which is what you want. Unfortunately, they didn't define what artificial intelligence was. They didn't really define the risk levels, and they had to get the bill approved by the Parliament. And so the European Parliament took this bill. They have more than 500 members there, all of whom want to be part of the AI revolution. So all of them came up with stupid things to put in the bill. And often they were completely contradictory. I mean, one example is, I want transparency into the data. I want to know what data is being used for training. Oh, but we have this other law that says the data has to be protected. So it can't be really transparent because that would reveal personal information. But we want the data to be representative. We need to make sure that it really reflects the full diversity of the European Union. Oh, but we want to make sure people can take their data out of the system. So right there, you've got a way that the data will be biased because you might be missing 10 or 20% of it. So it's just this inability to understand that you can't ask for three things that can't possibly all be true.
Also, there's a lot of expectations or compliance requirements. There's a lot of standardization which is supposed to be done by these agencies. You think they have the capacity to do all of these things, or would it be a lot of bureaucracy which will again hinder innovation?
One of my colleagues at Carnegie, about 7 months ago, wrote a wonderful open letter to the AI Act office. And it was basically saying, look at all the things you've got to do. Let's make sure you focus on what really matters. Part of it was what really matters is what people are buying these systems to do. You can't write rules on how the algorithm is supposed to work, particularly for AI. And if you know anything about AI, you know that the system rewrites itself. And the faster you add new data to it, the more it's going to change. Yeah. So the idea that we're going to certify your piece of software as being non-discriminatory or ethical AI, what does that mean?
Yeah, how is that measurable?
Okay, so it's for October 7th, it was ethical. But I just added another 3 terabytes. Maybe it's got a totally different impression of the world now. And now it's making really bad decisions. So that's not a viable approach.
But we do need to have certain guardrails, right? When we deploy AI.
Guardrails imply things made of metal that don't bend. I think you need 4 things, and this is my answer to all tech policy problems. CITE: competition, innovation, transparency, and this is one that I only added about 3 years ago: empathy. I had always assumed that governments and companies would have empathy. They would want to understand their customer to make them happy. But then Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk showed that if you get enough money, you don't care about the customers. So governments, I think, have to be in the business of pushing for transparency and pushing for empathy. Because if it doesn't happen, then we get these systems that are not designed with the user in mind. Transparency can help drive solutions to a lot of the problems that we're seeing, whether it's cybersecurity breaches, whether it's discrimination, whether it's misuse. If companies are doing things that are blatantly illegal, we'll know more and more quickly if they have to do some kind of reporting. And we see that with social media platforms. They have these transparency reports. When I was at Cloudflare, we filed a transparency report, partly as a way to discourage governments from coming at us and saying, we want to monitor Mike Nelson, give us all this data.
So on this side framework you spoke about, US is not doing good on competition as well as the other one, transparency, right? US, I think, would be graded low on both these fronts.
Right.
Because you have, at one end, you have tech monopolies, like one platform
I would argue
controlling.
that the US is one of the more competitive AI markets in the world. All of the largest AI models are coming out.
Well, for AI, but there are other issues where we've got problems.
But they're not transparent. At least they're not transparent.
So the transparency you talk of here is not the transparency that the EU is demanding of the AI market. They're two different things.
Right.
So
right. The transparency model that I'm working with is the one that we have for social media, where you don't have to show your code and you don't have to reveal your data. Yeah. The Chinese do that. They want to actually see the code. That's a whole nother issue. That's partly cybersecurity. They want to see the code to make sure there's not some backdoor that's being used to spy on the Chinese. That's a whole nother issue. So that's a third type of transparency. But transparency of the AI data is something that the European Union is just not going to be able to implement. It just doesn't make sense, and how do you know that you've been transparent enough? The transparency I'm talking about is, how is a system being used? And I think for at least the next few years, the most important transparency is transparency into how government is using artificial intelligence. And there's been a lot of pressure at the local level to make that happen. You have all the worries about facial recognition and how AI is being used for surveillance. You don't put limits on surveillance by the local police by rewriting the code. You make this a political issue where the local police and the mayor have to be accountable to the people, and they have to reveal how they're using these systems. And whether it's artificial intelligence or something you call machine learning, there are lots of surveillance software systems that don't use that.
Right.
And we just have to make it kind of an overall approach that whether it's a 20-year-old spreadsheet, we know what's being done. That's just good government and good corporate governance. A lot of companies have really found cutting corners and, collecting data on their customers when the customers don't know about it. That's not always good business. And when it shows up on the front page of the Times of India or the New York or the Wall Street Journal, people get fired. And stock prices drop 5, 10, 20%. So that's why transparency is so important. So it's the soft regulation that comes with brand management and keeping your customers happy, and more keeping your employees happy. We've seen this where, Amazon was working with the Defense Department about 5 years ago. No, Google.
Google. That was
yes,
the Google
that was
case.
a Google case. I think Amazon had something a little bit similar, but it was the employees found out. Oh my God, we're doing something that sounds pretty. In some cases, it wasn't. It could be justified, but you had to understand. In other cases, it was a very simple way to, in 7 or 8 words, make the company look really bad.
Yeah.
And the employees, people started quitting, saying, "Hey, I'm really good. I'm a great developer. I can go work wherever I want. I don't want to be associated with a company that does that." And so that's another check. And it's not regulatory at all, and no lawyers involved. A lot of journalists involved, and a lot of bloggers who are holding the companies to account.
But you need a vibrant democracy for that to happen as well.
It sure helps.
It
sure helps. But in a global world where investment is global, venture capitalists can actually be surprisingly good Democrats. And so that's another way to make sure that companies meet at least a minimum standard.
Do you see big AI companies emerging out of India in coming future?
I would think so. I mean, I was just in Taiwan last month. They have put so much of their focus on hardware for so many years. They are the semiconductor superpower, and they will be for a long time. I was interested to see that they've just made a huge investment here in India to work with Tata, and it's at least $10 billion to build chips, mostly for the auto industry. So they are definitely understanding that they can use the talent of Indian engineers. But I think some of the most exciting work in India will be getting the chip makers to work with Indian companies that will do some of the packaging, and there's a lot of revenue to be generated there. But India is, unlike China and Taiwan, has put a lot more emphasis on software. And you have incredible developers. And for some reason, you also have software people who are social enough and broad enough with this full set of skills needed to be CTOs, CIOs, and CEOs. We've all seen the stories about these incredible Indian engineers who are now running Microsoft and another one of the companies I used to work with, IBM. And I don't know why the Indian training programs for engineers have led to these kind of multifaceted people. When I was at IBM, I was part of the executive training program, and they did something for us called the Herman Brain Dominance Index. And you've seen similar things. Myers-Briggs is another example. This one I think is actually the best of them. But the assumption was that your brain has 4 different functions: emotional, structural, like spreadsheets, can you put data together, analytical, and creative. And each one had a color. So most people at IBM were either yellow for creative or blue for analytic. What do you think CEOs were? They've given this test to 2 million people in companies all over, not just the tech sector. What do you think of emotional, structural, creative, and analytic? What do you think CEOs were particularly good at?
Analytic?
Emotional?
Structural and emotional.
Emotional, I think.
They were mediocre at all 4. Because the most important thing the CEO has to do is understand the problem and then tell somebody else to work on it. And so they could understand what the skill was that was needed, and they could see, oh, you're really good at managing creative people.
How did Indians fare in this?
I have no idea.
Okay.
But I do know IBM had another very important survey, and you can look this up. I do not remember the name, but for 30 years, they would survey all of their incoming employees, not just their executives, people in training, and they would try to assess these different character traits. Maybe in your show notes, we can put a link to this work. But it was so funny because they actually found that a lot of these stereotypes that you have about different countries are true. I mean, the Latin Americans, there was a tendency towards supporting the strong leader, and when they started doing this, half the nations of Latin America were run by dictators. The Japanese, it really was that, I got to be part of the group. They have the famous saying in Japan, the nail that stands up gets hammered down.
Yeah.
And the most stunning thing that came out of this was that the Americans were off the scale on individual freedom and liberty. I'm going to do what I want. Nobody was even close on that. But I don't know. I don't know that they had a lot of people of Indian backgrounds 20 years ago who would have filled out that test.
Okay.
We'll find it out. We'll find it out.
Sure. At this point, we'll reorient our discussion towards a topic which is very hot right now, and that's supply chain security.
Yeah.
And suddenly everyone is concerned about whether supply chains are secure or not, and especially after Israel's pager attack, right?
Yeah.
If even low-tech products could explode like that, what happens to high-tech products? And then the whole fear of China putting backdoors in hardware. So earlier concern was about software and cybersecurity, right?
Right.
But now everyone is concerned about hardware as well. So what are your views, initial takes on supply chain security?
Well, unfortunately, this is an issue that's driving one of the other very damaging debates that I'm fighting around the world, and that is digital sovereignty. And it comes partly from the hardware concern, but also partly from concerns that I won't have the data I need to develop some new product or to run my government properly. On the other side of that issue is what happened in Ukraine. And Ukraine had to suddenly develop a backup government. And they were able to do it in less than a month. They just went to all the hyperscalers and said, we've got critical data. We don't want the Russians to have it. And if half the country's taken over, we want to be able to run the other half from servers that aren't subject to missile attacks. And so that's actually forced people to realize that maybe I do have to trust somebody somewhere else. Taiwan just made a major change in its policy on data localization and data flows. They had been very reluctant to share data and move it beyond borders. But they made the commitment to keep one copy of the data on the island, but to have backup in the cloud in Singapore, the United States, Japan, wherever they needed to be. They did put in some clear rules on how that data would be properly encrypted, so only Taiwanese entities would be able to access it. And that is, I think, the right solution. It's harder for the chips and for the packages in particular. And the chips might be solid and might be free of backdoors, but there's 101 ways that you can put it in the package on the board and just put a little extra thing in there and this is not new. During the first Iraq War, the American intelligence services were able to compromise some printers, and that they got stuck into the network. And this may not be quite right because people tend to boast, but the report was that they did significant damage to the entire air defense network of the country. So we obviously have these examples that make people very, very, very cautious. The good news is that market for most mass market items is huge. And if you really want to be secure, maybe you don't call up the Chinese and order 10,000 laptops. Maybe you buy them from a reseller in Belgium. Who's just bought a whole bunch of them from China, and the Chinese have no idea that they're going to end up at an Air Force base in Germany.
No, even if you don't buy from Chinese, let's say you buy from countries you generally trust or are your allies, right, with which your interests align at the moment, even then it is no surety that the person you're procuring it from is not procuring subcomponents from a different place, right? Mm-hmm. So supply chains are complex, they're long. It's not as if everything is based out of US or Belgium or any other place, right? So how do you take out certain actors from accessing a supply chain, malicious actors? Yeah. How do you do that?
Well, there are technologies that allow you to know that you've got a verified machine that hasn't been altered. There are different hardware components that go into it, can be put on a chip, and you can know that, okay, that is a chip we know the provenance. It's the mass market chips that have been out for 6 or 7 years where we have people making phony versions, and that's really, really troubling. But if I want to compromise somebody's system, I'm going to do it with buggy software components. We've seen some pretty insidious and sophisticated attempts to rewrite open source code. And again, that's something that one or two people can do. You don't have to get somebody with a big fab to cooperate with you. In one case was, I don't remember the name of the piece of code, but it was a piece of code that's in tens.
executable.
Yeah, and it wasn't, thousands of companies.
Yeah.
It's hundreds of thousands, maybe millions.
Yeah.
That comes back to digital identity, though, and to authentication, and not just of people. Obviously, you want to make sure you know the person who put their fingers in the code, but also to the actual object. And one of the best uses of blockchain and other ledger technologies is to verify that a piece of bits, a bucket of bits, a piece of software is what we think it is. I hope that with AI and the concern about security, we will have a real concerted effort to build in provenance tracking, build in authentication.
So with that, I'll pose one last question for this podcast.
It's always the hardest one. The last question is always the hardest one.
No, this one is a question that I hope our listeners will also think about. So your final thought on how India is faring in the parameters you described, like encryption, then data protection, digital identity, and so on. Just your preliminary takes.
Well, I'm writing that chapter right now.
Okay.
And so I invite all the people listening to give the grades that they think. At least send me an email or a tweet. On Twitter, I'm @ Mike Nelson, Nelson. I was one of the first 17,000 people on Twitter. So I actually got my own name. I signed up so I could be Barack Obama's representative in the first presidential Twitter debate. For 3 days, back when Twitter had only 140 characters, we debated digital identity, innovation, e-government. We sort of invented political Twitter. So it's all my fault. But @ Mike Nelson, just let me know. What are the 2 or 3 things that you think India is doing well? So far, based on a lot of conversations, both here and elsewhere, digital identity is clearly an A. I mean, and political leadership from the top has really helped. I think, although it's not on the list, India has done an incredible job in training the next generation of technical talent, and you've done it so well that you export it all around the world. So that's been very important. I'm encouraged by how you've addressed data protection. I think the principles and the consistency of the legislation is very good. But I don't think it's going to get implemented unless there's digital leadership. You've got either one person, one minister who stands up and bets their career on getting this done, or better,
but we
have Modi pushing it.
But we still don't have any law on health data.
Right.
Yeah. So there's many areas.
There are gaps.
There are many areas we have to work on. Any area of concern that you have?
Huge concern about is content moderation. Yeah. Also known as censorship. And again, it's really hard. In the U.S., we have this fight going on right now about are these companies spreading terrorists' information? Are they helping recruit people who will do damage to our country? But India has done well in connecting to the world. Another topic that's not on my report card list is data and tech for development. And I think India is really well positioned to get other countries to follow your lead.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you, Bharat and Rijesh. With that, we'll wrap up this podcast. Encourage our readers to think about these issues and where do you think India is faring on all these parameters. Do reach out to Mike on Twitter, and thank you so much for listening to us.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.